Good afternoon, everyone. Anyone has any questions before we start today? Okay. Today, what we want to do is we want to continue from where we left off last time. And that is, we talked about the Stopler-Samuelson, and we talked about the specific factor model, and we showed in both cases, in both models, after trade, who will be the factors that will be better off and which factors will be worse off. So we finished with that. Today, what I want to do is I want to look at what the magnification effect means. And the magnification effect happens to be something that Stopler-Samuelson stumbled over when they were doing a lot of work with their model in as far as the distribution of income between the factors of production. And they found in their calculations, they used a lot of, I don't want to include them here because they get a little bit complicated. And I did not even include them in my book either, simply because, it has a lot of equations, a lot of variables, a lot of assumptions, and it just confuses you more than it does anything else. So for that reason, I decided I'm really not going to go deep into what the magnification effect is, but at least we need to know the conclusions that the Stopler-Samuelson arrived at with the magnification effect and what it means. What it means is simply this, that if the price of the product increases by 10%, let's say, then the income of the factor that is used intensively in producing this good will increase by more than 10%. For example, let's say that the US and China are engaged in trade, and the US will be exporting aircraft. And we know that aircraft is a capital intensive good. Now we know that the price of exports will always go up. So the price of the good that the US exports will go up in the US. The price of the good that China exports will go up in China. So always the price of export will go up, the price of import will go down. Okay, going back to the example, that if the US happens to be selling aircraft to China, exporting aircraft, and now the price of aircrafts have gone up, let's say, by 3%. Then what the magnification effect tells us here is that the price of capital will increase by more than 3%. Nothing happens to the price of labor, because remember, to produce aircraft, you need both capital and labor. However, the magnification effect says that if the price of aircraft increases by a certain percentage, then the price of the factor that is used intensively in producing that good, only the factor that is used intensively in producing that good, will go up by more than 3%. This could also work in reverse. In other words, let's look at the price of textiles for the US. Textile is the imported good. So let's say the price of textiles after trade go down by 5%. And we know that textile is labor intensive. Therefore, when the price of textiles go down by 5%, then the price of labor, which is intensively used in the production of textiles, will go down by more than 5%. That's basically what the magnification effect is. Any questions on this? Okay, everyone now knows what the magnification effect is. So if you see a question like this in the exam, you'll know exactly what that means, magnification effect.
So you said for the reverse effect, like price of textile has gone down by 5%. Does that mean the price of labor goes down greater than 5%?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly what would happen. Any other question? Someone else had a question. No? Okay, so let's continue.
Wait, he said that price of labor goes down 5%, and I didn't catch what he said after that.
No, the price of labor will go down by more than 5%. Let's say if the price of textiles goes down by 5, then the price of labor will go down by more than 5.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Now we come to another thing here, and that is we want to find out the relationship between immigration and trade. Is there a relationship between them? In other words, does trade affect immigration? In other words, the more trade we have, do we expect to see more immigrants coming to the US, or do we see less, or it really doesn't matter? This is the question we want to answer. The relationship between trade and immigration. Now, we have to be very careful here because the relationship between trade and immigration is different in the long run than it is in the short run. Let me answer this and then give you some explanation. So in the long run, immigration and trade are substitutes. Immigration and trade are substitutes in the long run. So this is another likely multiple choice question, by the way. So make sure you pay attention. In the long run, again, trade and immigration are substitutes. In the short run, trade and immigration are complements. Okay, let's explain this. Let's start with the long run. When we say that immigration and trade are substitutes, what do we mean by that? We simply mean that if you have trade, there is no need for immigration to take place. If countries are trading with one another and there is free trade between them, then there is no reason for immigration. Okay, let's look at labor, for example. We know that we have Mexican workers trying to immigrate to the US looking for jobs. Why? Because Mexico is labor abundant and the US is labor scarce. So it makes sense for Mexican workers to migrate to the US looking for jobs. What we're saying here is if trade is taking place according to the HO model and the Ricardo model, then there is no reason for workers from Mexico to migrate to the US. The reason is very simple. Because trade here is going to be doing the same thing. In other words, when the US trades with Mexico, the US will be trading capital intensive goods with Mexico, will be exporting will be sending capital-intensive goods to Mexico and will be importing labor-intensive goods to the US. So in other words, trade is simply doing the job of migration. So instead of labor or workers physically migrating from Mexico to the US, what we have is goods that embody a lot of labor in them are moving from Mexico to the US. In other words, labor-intensive goods, goods that happen to embody a lot of labor. Is being transferred from Mexico to the US. So this is exactly the same thing. And when that happens, what do you think the impact of this trade on wages will be in Mexico and in the US in as far as labor is concerned? What does trade do to wages in labor and wages of labor in the US and wages of labor in Mexico? We have already seen that as a result of trade, the US will be importing labor-intensive goods. This will lead to a fall in the real wage of US workers. At the same time, when we are importing labor-intensive goods from Mexico, this will lead to an increase in the real wage in Mexico. So trade, on the other hand, stops immigration or migration at that point. There is no need for migration. There is no incentive for migrants to be moving from Mexico to the US. Why? Because real wages are increasing in Mexico and they are falling in the US. So why would you want to have workers migrating from Mexico to the US? That's number one. That's what trade does. Number two, trade is allowing Mexican workers to actually produce labor-intensive goods in Mexico and ship them over to the US. In other words, creating jobs for workers in Mexico. Everyone now understands the impact of trade on immigration in the long run? Any questions?
Is that what happened in 1996 when Bill Clinton signed that NAFTA?
True, that's what happened. But then again, of course, it backfired, and I will explain the reason why. In other words, you know, the NAFTA treaty, the goal of it was simply to try and keep Mexican workers in Mexico by earning higher wages. That was the goal of NAFTA. And it worked pretty well at the beginning, but then, of course, it started to backfire, and I'll explain the reason why. But
Is
this
it because the
yeah.
peso broke? The peso was just like it went bankrupt or something like that.
Very good. There was a huge fall in the peso, which led to a recession, which led to a lot of people being unemployed. That's number one. And number two, because of globalization and because of increased global trade, a lot of these countries were looking for other places to produce and manufacture their goods rather than Mexico. Why? Because Mexican workers were being paid a lot higher than their counterparts in China, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, etc. So a lot of these firms found it a lot cheaper to produce in those countries than to produce in Mexico. And this really put a lot of pressure on workers in Mexico to try and find other places where to find work. And obviously the US was an option. And that's the main reason why you saw an increase in migration from Mexico to the US and from Mexico to Canada, basically. Okay, so basically in the long run, we would expect to see a relationship between trade and migration that happens to be positive in the sense that both of them will be substitute for one another. In the short run, however, as I said, things are not going to be as clear and as smooth as they would be in the long run, simply because in the long run, what we are expecting to see is that most economies over the long run will converge to their long run equilibrium. What does that mean? That simply means that all economies, given enough time over the long run, will be able to settle to their long run equilibrium and have economic stability, have full employment, etc., etc. That's what long run equilibrium means. Long run macroeconomic equilibrium. In other words, you're going to have full employment, there are no recessions, everyone that wants a job can find a job. This happens over the long run when the economy attains long run equilibrium. So this whole idea about trade being substitutes to immigration can only result in an environment where long run equilibrium is being attained. However, in the short run and in the medium run, we don't have long run equilibrium. We have short run equilibrium, which would mean that economies have not found their good spot, if you will, in terms of employment, in terms of production, in terms of efficiency, etc., etc. So you will have recessions, you will have business cycles, you will have huge unemployment. That's what we would expect to see in the short run and medium run, if you will. And as a result, you will see that trade and immigration will be complements to one another. In other words, as trade increases, migration will also increase. Whereas over the long run, as trade increases, migration would fall. So that's basically, and I don't want to, go further than I have just mentioned right now, because that's basically all what you need. We still have a lot to cover, so we need to move along unless someone has a question regarding this, but I think it's pretty much straightforward, very, very clear.
Just to confirm, you said that trade increases, migration increases, and that relates to the short run, right?
Correct. That's exactly what would happen in the short run and the medium run, simply because economies are not at their full employment equilibrium. Economies are facing cyclical fluctuations in economic activity. And as a result, you will see that people are moving all over the place, trying to look for jobs simply because of the disequilibrium that occurs as a result of recessions, a result of business cycles, results of working below productive capacity, etc. This happens in the short run and in the medium run. In the long run, these things will not happen. That's why we're making a distinction here between short run and long run. So long run equilibrium is very different from short run equilibrium. And probably from your principles of macro, I'm sure that your professors were able to explain the differences between the two. But that's basically what it is. Okay, the other thing that we want to explain here is, does trade make the poor even poorer? In other words, does trade widen the gap between the wages of the skilled and the wages of the unskilled? Now, there are a lot of pundits, especially on the media, who happen to be against trade, will probably tell you that the culprit for all of this is basically trade. Trade is the reason, trade is the cause. If we didn't have trade, then we won't have this wage gap. And the answer obviously is not true. Now, trade may be responsible for this wage gap, but only for a very little percentage. In other words, studies have shown, empirical studies, by the way, I'm not talking about haphazard conclusions or arbitrary conclusions. I'm talking about empirical studies based on real data done by some reputable economists. And they have actually found that trade, at best, is probably responsible for 7% of the wage gap. So what are the other factors that may be responsible for this wage gap? Well, they have listed other factors, including technology, education, immigration, and union weakness. And they have found also that because of all of these factors, including trade, of course, because trade is, as I said, is probably responsible for 7%. But all these factors taken together, they have in fact made income inequality a pervasive phenomenon, meaning you will find this income inequality everywhere you go. And I was very surprised, by the way, a couple of years ago, I was looking at a research paper that looks at income inequality in the US. And obviously, I'm not an expert on income inequality. This is basically far from my area of expertise. But, I was just looking through the paper, and I was pretty interested to see exactly what's going on as far as income inequality is concerned in the US. And from the paper, I was able to determine, I was looking at the trends because the paper was highly mathematical. And I was looking at basically the trends for the US income inequality from the 1960s all the way down to the late 2000s. And the trend was upward, meaning that income inequality in the US has been on the increase. Now, this must be very alarming, especially for policymakers, public policymakers, because you really don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you have macroeconomic policies in place that will try to reduce this income inequality as much as possible. Because the consequences of this can be very dire for the economy as a whole. And I don't know, right now, as I said, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm really not following it. I'm not seeing what public policymakers are doing, and I'm really not pretty much attuned to the numbers, the data, the literature, etc. Because if you really want to be an expert on these type of issues, you really have to be well prepared in terms of understanding all the issues that happen to be prevalent in as far as income inequality is concerned. So I really don't know what public policymakers are doing right now. I don't know if there has been a slight improvement now or not. As I said, I've not been following it, but from what I know, it's very alarming, and it's an issue that needs a lot of attention from public policymakers. However, let's look at a simple model, demand-supply model, to see what the impact of these factors are on the wage gap between skilled and unskilled. So on the vertical axis, what we want to measure is we want to measure the wages of skilled workers relative to unskilled workers. So we're going to be working with ratios on both the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis. So on the vertical, we're going to look at relative wages, skilled over unskilled. On the horizontal axis, we're going to look at employment of skilled over unskilled. So let's do it. Let's go and see what's going to happen here. There you have it. This is your model. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Now let's look at demand. This is our demand for, this is the initial demand for skilled workers relative to unskilled. And this is our supply, initial supply of skilled workers over unskilled. Now the point of intersection is right here. So this will tell us exactly what the wage ratio would be. And this will tell us exactly what the labor ratio in terms of employment would be. So given these demand and supply, we can see from here that skilled workers will be paid twice as much as unskilled. That's what the 2 means. Twice as much. Now let's say that there is an increase in trade in the US, and that the US happens to be labor skilled abundant. So when the US trades, what do you think is going to happen to the demand for skilled over unskilled? Increase, decrease, stay the same? What was going to happen? Well,
Repeat the question.
yeah. What will happen to the demand for skilled versus unskilled labor if the US happens to be skill abundant and now the US trades with other countries? What will happen to the demand for,
Increase.
what's that?
It'll increase.
It will increase, very good, it will shift. Why? Well, simple reason, because the US is skilled abundant. Therefore, the US will be producing goods that are skill intensive and will be exporting those goods. So the demand for skilled workers would increase, and this would show a rightward shift. So now we will have a new wage ratio, which corresponds to 2.5. So what has happened to the wage gap between skilled and unskilled?
It increased.
It increased. So that's basically what trade would do. And they're absolutely right from that point. That's why I said it's about 7% due to trade. Now, What happens if there is an increase in technology? Technology now becomes a little bit more sophisticated. There is a huge advances made in the sector. What would happen now? Forget about trade. There is no trade going on here. There's just an improvement in technology.
Goes down.
What's that?
Demand
What
will
was the
decrease.
question again?
Yeah. What happens if there is an improvement in technology? Technology becomes more sophisticated, and we're really not trading with anyone. So what do you think is going to happen to our domestic wage ratio, skilled workers versus unskilled?
It'll be unequal.
Demand will go down and price will go up,
Demand will go down.
and the price will go up.
So if demand goes down, how come price go up?
The quantity demanded will decrease, not quantity, not the demand going down, but the quantity demanded will decrease.
If the price goes up, quantity demanded will decrease. Quantity demanded of what?
Demanded for skilled labor workers, isn't that?
Oh,
the question was?
so here you're
I must
saying,
have misunderstood.
okay, so here you're saying that the demand is not going to shift. There's only going to be a movement.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, any other answers?
Demand and wage go down. They both go down
They both go down. Why?
because you have technology now. You don't need skill workers anymore. You don't need labor.
Not so. Technology still doesn't work by itself. You still need someone to work the technology to administer it. Excuse me. So obviously, you're not going to be needing unskilled labor, but you will be needing a lot of skilled, sophisticated labor to go with that sophisticated technology. So what's going to happen to the demand for skilled labor? Demand will shift to the right. Not a movement, complete shift. Because what will cause movements along this is a change in the wage ratio. So here we're not talking about any change in wage ratios. We're talking about changes in other factors besides the wage ratio, which is technology. Technology is becoming more advanced. As a result, you need more advanced, skilled labor to work with this technology. Therefore, the demand will shift to the right. And as a result, you will see right here, you will have a new equilibrium wage ratio, which is 2.5. So it has widened the gap. Okay. How about if we have an increase in immigration? Unskilled workers, more unskilled workers coming in. What would that do to the wage gap?
Wouldn't it increase it more, the wage gap? Because then you'd be labor abundant of unskilled workers.
Yes, you would be labor abundant of unskilled workers, yes, but what would happen to the wage ratio? Here, remember, we're talking about wage ratios here.
So the wage ratio would go down, right?
Very good. Will go down. Why do you think it would go down? I don't know if it would go down or not, but why? Let's let the model do that for us. But at least why you think so?
Because it's labor abundant, but you're gonna have more the average that will bring the average down, right?
What happens to the ratio?
It goes down.
Well, Absolutely. So what would happen to the supply of skilled labor versus unskilled labor?
There would be a bigger gap.
Yeah, but what would happen? What would happen to the supply curve? You see, right now,
It increases.
all what I'm
It would
interested
increase.
all what
It
I'm
increases.
interested in right now is what is happening to the supply and demand. And I'm really not worried about what happens to the wage rate and what happens to the labor ratio. The demand supply would tell me that. Okay, so right now, all what I'm interested in is how those curves are going to shift. And now we have our initial demand and we have our initial supply. And this is the initial wage ratio, which simply means that skilled workers are getting paid twice as much. And now what I'm saying is, suppose there is an increase in immigration of unskilled workers to the US. Will this affect demand? No. Demand is not going to be affected by it. Will it affect supply? Yes. What will happen to the supply curve? It will decrease. It will shift to the left. There will be a decrease in the supply. Why? Because here we're talking about ratios, skilled over unskilled. So if you increase unskilled, what happens to your ratio? Will it fall or will it go up?
It
It
would
would go down,
What's that?
down.
It would fall, correct. So that's why the supply curve will shift inward to the left. So now what happens? So now we have a new wage right there, 2.5 times, which is obviously a lot more than 2, which would widen the gap. Okay, now let's take another factor. So we looked at immigration, we looked at trade, we looked at technology. Now let's look at education. And what happens when the US invests in education, in training programs, in producing more skilled workers through education?
Labor ratio goes up.
What's that?
The labor ratio would go up.
Very good, which means the supply curve will
shift to the right.
very
Stay
good.
the same, right?
Will shift to the right. Will shift to the right. There will be an increase in the supply simply because now with education, all what you're doing is you're really bringing in more skilled workers through education. So the ratio would increase, which would lead to an increase in the supply curve. As the supply curve increases, now you have a new ratio, which is 1.5. So what has education done to the wage gap?
It's increased it.
No, has reduced it. Before it was 2, now it's 1.5. Before, what do you see happening to skilled workers versus unskilled? They're getting paid twice as much. Now they only get paid 1.5 times. Why? Because you have increased the pool of skilled workers. So when you increase the pool of skilled workers, you're obviously going to narrow the wage gap. And that's exactly what happens. So one of the solutions to narrowing the wage gap is education. Investing more in education. So this way you can obviously, so those unskilled can be turned into skilled. Basically, that's what you're doing. And as a result, you will be narrowing the wage gap ratio between the skilled and the unskilled. In other words, you will have a lot more skilled workers versus unskilled workers. So obviously, the wage ratio proportionally will be made better off. In other words, instead of having a huge wage gap, that huge wage gap now will be pretty much narrowed simply because more and more of unskilled workers are becoming skilled workers. So the proportionality would change. And as a result, you can actually make a dent into income inequality. That's basically what that is. And it's very simple, very straightforward. Okay, so we talked about all of that. And now the next thing that we want to look at is what type of empirical work was done to validate the HO model? Because after all, we want to put this HO model to the test. And we want to see if the HO model happens to explain trade patterns in the real world. In other words, we want to know if in the real world, capital abundant countries happen to be exporting capital intensive goods, and labor abundant countries happen to be exporting labor intensive goods. And this is what the HO model predicts. So what we want to do is we want to put those predictions to the test. And one of the economists that actually run a test on the HO model was Wassily Leontief, a US economist from Harvard University, who actually used empirical studies to determine if the US was actually exporting capital intensive goods and importing labor intensive goods. This is exactly what Leontief set out to do. And he used, again, economic data from about 200 industries in, let's see now, where is that? Does it say that? Yeah, right here. Wassily Leontief. First attempt to test factor endowment theory empirically. What is given to Leontief? The HO assumption here that the US has relatively abundant capital and the US is relatively scarce in labor. Now, according to the HO theory, the US should be exporting capital intensive goods and importing labor intensive goods. So Leontief went out to find out if these propositions were correct. And what he did was he tested capital labor ratios for 200 export industries and import competing industries in the US in 1947. This is exactly what he did. To his surprise, Leontief came up with results that were pretty much contradictory to the HO model. So what did Leontief find from using this data on this 200 export and import industries for the US? He found that the US was actually exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. And as a result, his finding was referred to by other economists as the Leontief paradox, meaning it is highly contradictory to the HO model. Now, Leontief ran the same tests again, but for a different period. So he actually went from 1947 to 1955. And again, he looked at, I think, about 150 industries. And again, he came up with the same conclusion, that the US is exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. And at that point, Leontief said, I give up. I'm really not going to do any more tests. I'm pretty much satisfied of my findings. And he said that as far as I'm concerned, the HO model is irrelevant. It's meaningless. That's how Leontief commented, by the way. Now, other economists looked at these results and said, well, wait a minute. There's got to be something wrong here. I mean, you know, after all, the HO model is pretty much sophisticated in its conclusions and in its methodology and its assumptions, and you know, everything seems to be working extremely well. So why would Leontief find such a contradiction? And some economists did their own work, their own empirical studies, and they found actually mixed results. They found that the HO model still does a very good job of predicting trade patterns. And some economists, they said, no, actually it doesn't, it's half-half. Another economist sided with Leontief and said, no, it really doesn't do. So obviously what we ended up from all these studies is mixed results. Now, one of the reasons given for this mixed results, or for why Leontief and some other economists came with some contradictions, is because Leontief and those economists who came up with these contradictions failed to separate labor into skilled and unskilled, and failed to separate or disaggregate capital into its different forms. You have human capital, you have knowledge capital, you have physical capital. So capital comes in different forms, and it is not advisable to actually lump them all in one basket. Now, when economists did that, they found that the US happens to be exporting labor skilled intensive goods and not labor intensive like Leontief wrote. So there's a huge difference between exporting labor skilled intensive goods than simply labor intensive goods. Makes a huge difference. Why? Because the US is obviously manufacturing goods that require a lot of sophisticated capital as well as skilled labor. Whereas there may be other goods that only require rudimentary capital and unskilled labor to produce them. So according to this economist, if we really want to find out if the HO model is relevant or not, we really have to disaggregate labor and disaggregate capital into their different forms. Like, for example, you may have certain products that need very rudimentary capital to produce, such as, for example, shoes, producing shoes, or producing shirts, or producing toys. All of this would need capital that's really not that sophisticated, basically. Whereas if you're looking at aircrafts, And if we're looking at computers, and if we're looking at automobiles, all those products require highly sophisticated capital. Now, obviously, I have my own, and I'm not going to go into it because this really is going to open this up. It's like a Pandora box that I really don't want to open up because if I do, I'm just going to make you confused and I don't want to do that. But still, you know, in my book, I do make certain points regarding the Leontief paradox, and I do go a little bit into detail explaining those things, but for our purposes, we don't need to do that. It's just, what's important here is we know what the Leontief paradox is. And if you were asked to find, well, what are the weaknesses of this Leontief paradox, then you can talk about the disaggregation of capital and labor. Full stop. That's where you need to stop. You really don't need to go any further than that. Okay, is this understood? So everyone understand what's going on so far? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. Yeah, along the way, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Always ask questions. That's what I'm here for. And as I told you, I never shy away from questions. I love questions. Now, sometimes, you know, you may ask me a question that I have no answers for, and I'll be more than happy to tell you I don't know what the answer is. You know, but I'll try my best. You know, I love questions. All these things that I'm going through right now, we're going to skip over. We're not going to include them. And because we can't look at all models, it's just impossible. Because if we do that, we'll probably just focus on going over models the whole semester, basically, and we don't have time. So all of these things, we're just going to skip over. Not going to worry about. Now here, this is where we're going to stop. Dynamic competitive advantage. Very important. Now, if you remember, when we looked at the Ricardian theory, we saw that Ricardo pretty much emphasized specialization and reallocation of existing resources. That's what Ricardo focused on, specialization and reallocation of existing resources. So in fact, he was very much looking at a static model. In other words, Ricardo's theory does not allow for a dynamic change in an industry's competitive advantage over time. It ignores the fact that additional resources can actually be available through either trade or through industrial policy. And I will explain what industrial policy is in just a minute. But we can actually make more resources available. We can actually, as a result, create what we call competitive advantage. So in other words, you know, competitive advantage is not a static concept, it's a dynamic concept. It can be created. However, the Ricardo Mobile overlooked this possibility, and he simply focused on competitive advantage being a static concept. Now, all you need to know about why competitive advantage is a dynamic concept is simply look at Japan in the post-war period. In other words, late 40s, early 50s. By using industrial policy, Japan was able to create a competitive advantage in the steel industry. And Japan did not have a competitive advantage in the steel industry before. But when the government decided that, hey, we need to focus on the steel industry because of its outward linkages. It's very important. Therefore, we need to support this industry in any way possible. And that's why they had industrial policy geared towards the steel industry. In other words, industrial policy here simply involves a strategy that really deals with revitalizing, improving, and developing an industry. So all of the government resources will be honed towards that activity, basically. And you will see that the Japanese government, they were simply mobilizing capital, skilled labor, technology, everything that they had at their disposal was mobilized towards the steel industry for one purpose, and that purpose was to create a comparative advantage in the steel industry, and Japan was successful in doing it. You see that in the 60s and 70s, other countries in Asia, particularly East Asia, such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, Malaysia, etc. All those countries pursued exactly the same strategy that Japan was pursuing before. And that is using industrial policy to promote certain industries whereby those industries can actually create a comparative advantage. So that's basically what industrial policy is all about. Now, there are challenges, of course, with industrial policy. In other words, when governments are ready to implement industrial policy, the first thing that they need to do is to identify which industries they need to support. And in this case, of course, the industries that they need to support are those that happen to be winners. Now, what do we mean by that? We simply mean industries that have high growth potentials. In other words, it does not make any sense to spend money on something that is not worth spending on, throwing good money after bad money, so to speak. And you don't want to do that. So first of all, you want to identify which industries happen to be giving you the highest productivity, or you expect them to give you the highest productivity. In other words, they have good future potentials. Now, a lot of countries would look to what we call the sunrise industries. Now, sunrise here simply means industries that have great potentials, that have enough room for improving productivity. Those are known as the sunrise industries. This is the term we use to refer to those industries. A good example would be the high-tech industries. High-tech or sunrise. So this is basically what governments have to do. And once they do that, then they can implement those industrial policies accordingly by giving antitrust immunity to corporations, tax incentives, R&D subsidies, loan guarantees, low interest rate loans, trade protection. All of these things are type and parcel, if you will, of industrial policy. That's what industrial policy involves, doing all of these things in order to create the so-called comparative advantage that I just talked about. And of course, the book really does have a lot of examples to show you in the real world what countries have done to actually make industrial policy work in their favor You look at Boeing, for example, in the US. Without US help, I don't think they would have been able to reach the plateau that they have reached in terms of aircraft manufacturing, commercial jet airlines. Same thing with Airbus in Europe. Without the help and industrial policies pursued by the EU, Airbus is not going to go anywhere. So again, the book goes through all of that. I mean, you can go through it. We don't have time actually to be discussing these things simply because of the time limitations, unfortunately. But you could go through them one by one, and you can see why industrial policy is important and how it has helped certain countries create competitive advantage in certain industries. And then also you have government regulations. Now, government regulations in terms of workplace safety, product safety, clean environment, all of these things can actually affect competitive advantage. So on the one hand, we see industrial policies that does promote competitive advantage and creates competitive advantage. On the other hand, we have government regulations that may do exactly the opposite. You may have a competitive advantage in something, and now as a result of government regulations, you have obviously destroyed that competitive advantage. So you see how this works? Industrial policies, government regulations. And, this is, it's a very difficult issue. In other words, government regulations, on the one hand, they happen to improve the well-being of the public. That's why we have government regulations. And on the other hand, it may actually destroy the competitive advantage that certain firms have. And this may lead to unemployment, it may lead to low production, it may lead to reduced consumption, etc. So this is a very thin line to walk on, if you will, which are presented to public policymakers. And obviously it's a very difficult decision to make, but unfortunately for us, we don't have to make those decisions. But unfortunately for public policymakers, they really have to make those decisions, and they have to do the best they can given the circumstances, the situation, etc. Okay, so let's move on. Are there any questions before I move on? Okay, now let's look at an example here. How government regulations may actually affect trade and may affect production and consumption. And will also lead to a reduction in the competitiveness status of that country that is actually imposing all of these government regulations. So let's look at South Korea and the US. Now, these countries are both producing steel. Now, South Korea has a competitive advantage in steel production simply because it can produce it at $400 per ton, whereas the US will produce it at $600 per ton. So we have two different autarky prices. And from those autarky prices, I can tell who has the comparative advantage. And the comparative advantage here lies with South Korea. Now, once trade opens up, we will have one single price, and that price will be determined between 400 and 600. Now, given demand and supply, we don't have to arbitrarily choose the price. The price will be chosen for us by demand and supply. So now the price that will be given by demand and supply will be 500, which lies between 400 and 600. And the reason why that is because if you take that $500 in South Korea, you will find that $500, South Korea is willing to produce 7 million tons. Let's say this is in millions. Whereas South Koreans are only gonna consume 3 million tons. So now, what is the excess supply in South Korea?
4 million.
4 million, very good. Now I come to the US. At $500 per ton, how much is the US willing to consume? 14. When the price is 500, the demand will determine that, which is 14 right there. Now, at 500, how much will US firms produce? 10 million. So there is an excess demand of what?
4 million tons.
4 million. So 4 million excess demand here is exactly equal to the 4 million excess supply there. So this would be the export. Excess supply is always exports. Excess demand is imports. So what can I say about equilibrium? Do I have equilibrium or not?
Yes.
Very good. I have equilibrium. Therefore, this is the price I'm going to choose. I can't choose any other price, because if you choose any other price between 400 and 600, you may not have equilibrium. So this is the importance of having demand and supply, because now, once I have demand and supply, I don't have to arbitrarily choose or select the world price. Demand and supply will do that for me. And I have shown you exactly what we need to do in order to find what the price is going to be. The price will only occur when we have trade equilibrium. By trade equilibrium, we simply mean import is equal to export. Okay, now we're clear with that. Let's say now all of a sudden the US decides to impose regulations in terms of clean environment, workplace safety, product, whatever it is. This would immediately shift the supply curve upward. Why? Because now it will cost the US more to produce each ton of steel than before. That's why the supply curve shifts upward. Now, by how much it shifts, that's really determined by the cost through regulations. So the author obviously assumed where the supply curve is going to be, and we're going to agree with the author, and we're not going to question the author. Okay, how did you get the supply curve right there? Why not here? Or why not there? Well, again, we're really not interested in the position. All what we're interested in is in the direction. In other words, going this way and not this way. That's what I'm interested in. So whatever the position is, I'm fine with that. Okay. So now, if the price, if the cost of production increases in the US, South Korea will look at that and will say, well, you know what? Here, of course, we are only assuming that there are two countries producing steel. But South Korea would say, well, wait a minute. the cost in the US has gone up, so US producers cost of producing steel at home is going to go up. So you know what? I can actually go a little bit higher and still get US producers, get the US to import more steel from me. And they will say, okay, let's try 600. Okay, at 600, this is the demand and this is the supply. So at 600, Korea will produce 9 million tons. At 600, they will only consume 1 million. So what's the difference here?
8 million.
8 million. So South Korea hopes and expects to export 8 million. But wait a minute. Let's go to the US and check what demand and supply are telling us. Okay, we will put 600 because that's what Korea expects to charge. And let's see at 600, given the new supply curve, how much or how many tons of steel will the US produce?
4 million.
4 million, correct? Okay, at 600, how many tons of steel the US is willing to consume?
12 million.
Consume, how many? Right here, 12 million. If the price is 600 and you have the demand, what is the demand telling you? 12 million, right? At 600. If the price goes down to 500, the demand is telling you now you want to consume 14. So at 600, we're willing to consume 12. But at 600, we're also willing to produce 4. So there is an excess demand of how much?
8 million.
8 million, very good. So is this excess demand, which is imports, is it equal to the excess supply, which is exports here at this price of 600?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. So again, this would be the new price. So instead of 500, now the US has to accept that world price of $600. So who do you think is going to be gaining the most here?
South Korea.
Very good, South Korea. And who do
So
you,
you're saying,
what's
so
that?
you're saying with, oh, sorry. So you're saying with government regulations, some countries can actually benefit from this.
Absolutely. When you regulate industry here, other countries are going to benefit from it. That's for sure. Because what you're doing is you're making costs a lot higher here. And as a result, you are inducing consumers here to pay a higher price. That's the bottom line. Okay. Does this graph explain exactly what government regulations would do to exports and imports?
Yeah.
Very good, because remember before, how many were we exporting and importing for the US? How much were they importing before the regulations? 4. That's imports. And how much was South Korea exporting? 4. Okay, with the regulation, how much is the US importing? 10. I'm sorry, the US, 12 minus 4 is 8. I'm sorry, it's 8. 12 minus 4. This is exactly how much the US is importing. So before, they were importing 4, now they are importing 8 million tons. South Korea was exporting 4, now they are exporting 8 million tons. So obviously regulations, what it does is that it increases trade It increases exports and imports, but at the expense of one country. In other words, the exporting country will become a lot better off, and the importing country obviously is going to be worse off as a result of regulations, because domestic production will be reduced. Before the regulation, US firms were producing 10 million. After regulation, US firms are only producing 4 million. So that's a 6 million decrease in production. Huge amount. Anyway, so that's basically what it is. Okay, let's keep going. Transportation costs.
I'm sorry, it's 3:45.
Oh, 3:45. I was just about to look at the chats just to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, let's see now from Tiffany Trin. Okay, this is no question there. I missed it too, but based on what he just said, as trade, which I don't know what's that, as trade increases, migration increases, which indicates they are complements. That's true. Okay. Yeah, I guess there isn't really many comments. Anyway, are there any questions before we close?
I was curious, when is our exam?
As I said, the exam will be once we finish chapter 4.
Okay.
Any other questions? By the way, has anyone had any difficulties with the recordings? Were you able to retrieve the recordings from the links that I sent you? Anyone? Say yes or no. Just want to know.
Don't have the problem to hear it, but for the September 17th one, it mentions they have 2 recording, but I only see 1 recording on September 17th.
What do you mean 2 recordings or 1 recording? We have 2 recordings per week.
Okay, so it's the September 15 and September 17. It's mentioned about it.
Okay, so you don't have those?
Yes, I do have that.
Oh, okay. Which ones you don't have?
I do have it.
Okay, so you don't have a problem then.
No.
Okay, good. Anyone else has any problem with the recordings? Okay, so I will post the link for the recording today. I'm trying actually to get all of this on YouTube, so just in case you're having problems with the links, you can go to YouTube, just put my name, Nasser Douala, and you should be able to get all. In fact, I have other recordings beside this, so you may find them interesting, especially when it comes to trade deficits. I do have a whole presentation on trade deficits. So for those of you who are interested, you can always go on YouTube, just put my name, Nasser, Nasser, Douala. And all of those recordings you'll be able to see and hear. And yeah, so I'm trying to, get everything on YouTube. Just a few things I need to, because this is a new laptop that I have, and it needs a lot of work. I need to have to do a lot of things to it so as to put it up to par, so I can make all the necessary changes. But hopefully, we will be there sometime soon. Okay, any other questions? Okay, then everyone have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Take care now.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good one.
Thank you.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.